You can always tell when the tide is turning, especially when your secretary, who used to greet you every morning with a smile and hot coffee, suddenly won't meet your eyes. That morning, when Elaine buried herself in paperwork as I walked in, I knew something was wrong. My name is Warren Blake, 42 years old, senior accountant at Evermount Systems in Denver, Colorado. For almost a decade, I'd been the guy behind the spreadsheets, the quiet watchdog who caught mistakes, flagged red flags, and kept things honest. But lately, honesty had gone out of fashion. People stopped talking when I entered the room. Meeting invites dried up overnight. Even worse, my access to key financial folders on the server had been revoked. Quietly, without notice, I'd seen this kind of thing before. But what really made the hairs on my neck stand up was what I'd found in the quarterly reports. Just days earlier, vendor payments without documentation, revenue booked before contracts were even signed, and a ghost. Account shifting millions in and out of view. 3 weeks earlier, I'd raised concerns to our new CFO, Brent Calloway, who'd come in after our longtime financial chief stepped down suddenly. Brent brushed me off with smooth words and corporate charm. But deep down, I knew this wasn't modernization. This was misdirection, and I was seeing too much. I'd been with Evermount since our team of 30 worked out of a converted warehouse on the edge of Denver's industrial district. That was before the tech boom, before the IPO, before the board started filling seats with people who only spoke in market trends and exit strategies. These days, we had over 300 employees in a glass tower downtown, but I still carried the same ceramic mug my daughter made me in middle school. Numbers were my world, and I could feel, like an itch in my bones, that the ones I was seeing didn't add up. Brent Calloway had swept in the company like a man on a mission. Ivy League credentials, a resume full of big names and bold claims. But something about him rang hollow, too smooth, too quick to speak in buzzwords. And ever since he'd taken over from Robert Wellen, our former CFO who'd stepped down suddenly after what they said was a minor heart attack, things in the finance department had shifted. Too fast. Brent wasn't interested in questions. When I flagged inconsistencies in Q2 reporting, like revenue showing up before contracts were fulfilled, he smiled, thanked me for my diligence, and told me to trust the new workflow. When I followed up with a detailed email listing clear examples, some with millions of dollars swinging through phantom accounts, I got silence. And when I finally caught him alone in the break room, he gave me the line I now couldn't forget. Warren, you're the old guard. The board wants forward momentum. Sometimes that means changing how we view the details. That was when I knew I wasn't just dealing with a different management style. I was staring at something more deliberate, more dangerous. 20 years in finance teaches you a few things. One of them is that when someone tells you to ignore the details in favor of big picture thinking, you'd better start digging. And dig I did. My access to core folders had been quietly limited 2 days before. But I still had backups of reports I'd generated, and I'd saved a number of spreadsheets locally before Brent started modernizing our internal systems. What I found made my stomach drop. Patterns, shifting revenue entries, expenses hidden across multiple departments, whole contracts that looked like they'd been backdated to inflate Q1 performance. It wasn't sloppiness, it was precision fraud, the kind that could fool most investors, and even many auditors, unless they knew exactly where to look. I documented everything, compiled it into a secure folder, stored it on a flash drive I carried in my wallet. I didn't know what my next step was yet, but I knew better than to walk into another meeting empty-handed. Then, on a quiet Thursday morning, the email hit meeting request 1100 a.m. with HR. I didn't need to open it to know what was coming. I sat at my desk, finished my coffee, and began packing, not in a hurry, calm, focused. I'd been loyal, quiet, effective. But in the end, that wasn't what they wanted anymore. What they wanted was for me to stop asking questions. The meeting itself was as sterile as it gets. Paula from HR sat beside Brent, who wore a polite, almost bored expression. "We're restructuring the finance department," he said. "Unfortunately, your position has been eliminated." Not terminated, eliminated. Like I was a spreadsheet cell being cleared out. I nodded, not saying a word, as Paula slid a folder toward me. Severance terms, NDA paperwork, continuation of benefits. 6 months of salary, she said, like that would soften the blow. But the non-disclosure agreement was thick, full of clauses meant to muzzle me from discussing anything related to financial procedures, reporting structures or internal controls. And just when I thought the show was over, Brent added one last line: "Would appreciate your discretion, for the sake of team morale." I looked at the folder, then at him. "I'll need to have my attorney review this," I said plainly. That wiped the smile from his face. I left the building escorted by security, cardboard box in hand, while employees who used to greet me looked away or whispered in corners. A few people, like Jason, my former junior analyst, made quiet gestures of support. "They've reassigned all your reports to the Boston group," he muttered as he helped pack up my last few belongings. "Nobody understands what's going on. They're not even explaining the changes." Outside, in the parking garage, I sat in my car for a moment, silent. No anger. Just a strange, steady clarity. They hadn't eliminated me because I was obsolete. They'd eliminated me because I'd seen too much. And I'd asked the wrong questions. As I drove home, the flash drive in my wallet felt heavier than ever. That evening, over dinner, I told my wife Ellen everything. And as I pulled out the flash drive and laid it on the table, she reached for her phone. "You need to talk to my brother," she said. Tonight? Her brother, Thomas Ridley, worked at the SEC. And with that, a new chapter quietly began. Thomas Ridley didn't waste time. By 8 a.m. the next morning, I was sitting across from him in his modest Denver office. No skyscraper, no sleek glass walls, just shelves full of binders, a coffee maker that had seen better days, and the quiet tension of someone who spent years chasing numbers most people never notice. Thomas had been with the Securities and Exchange Commission for over a decade. He wasn't flashy, but he was sharp. Ellen used to joke that he could find an error in a haystack. That morning I handed him the flash drive. "I don't have all the details yet," I told him, "but I know this isn't just a few bad entries. It's coordinated." He plugged in the drive and began to skim the files. It didn't take long before his brow furrowed. "This isn't just earnings inflation," he muttered. "Some of this looks like asset concealment, maybe even shell routing." That was when the shift happened, from brother-in-law to federal investigator. He asked me for everything I remembered, every conversation, every document I hadn't brought yet. Over the next 3 hours, we put together a rough timeline. From the moment Brent Calloway arrived to the subtle shift in accounting patterns. From the CFO change to my access being revoked. Thomas's expression hardened as I described the NDA and the language that practically begged me to pretend nothing ever happened. "They're trying to shut you up," he said, hard, when I told him about Robert Whalen, our old CFO, stepping down for health reasons. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You talked to him lately?" "No. Last I heard, he was recovering from a heart episode." "Try reaching out, see if he'll talk." I did. Robert sounded older, slower than I remembered, but he agreed to meet me for lunch. We chose a quiet diner outside the city. No neckties, no noise. Just coffee, soup, and a quiet man who looked like he hadn't slept right in months. "I tried to stop it," Robert said, stirring his soup without eating. But Brent came in with board backing. Told me flat out that the old way was too rigid. When I pushed back, I started having meetings without invites. Then I was asked to sign off on numbers I didn't believe. That's when my health problems started. Funny how that happens. "You think they forced you out?" He laughed without humor. "I think they let me know the cost of staying." Robert didn't have documents. He'd wiped his files clean the day he left, but his account lined up with everything I had. He agreed to give a sworn statement if needed. I promised to protect his name for now. Later that week, I sat down with my attorney, Sarah Jensen, a no-nonsense type who'd worked SEC whistleblower cases before. When she read through the NDA and severance offer, her eyebrows hit the ceiling. "This is hush money," she said. "They even added a clause stating you hadn't observed or suspected any unlawful activity. If you had signed this, you'd be disqualified from whistleblower protections." I stared at the words. One line, one signature. That was all that stood between me and being legally silenced. "They knew exactly what they were doing," I said. Sarah nodded. "Most companies do. But you didn't sign, which means you're still protected. And if what you have holds up, the SEC may want to move quickly." Over the next week, Thomas and his team quietly launched an informal investigation. Nothing official yet. No paper trail. They were testing the waters, pulling recent filings, requesting copies of public reports. Meanwhile, I spent hours rebuilding timelines, listing names, charting unusual transactions. I remembered everything. Who approved what, when the patterns started, what systems were changed. It felt like building a map out of string and thumbtacks. And just when I thought I had all the pieces, a call came in from Jason, my former junior analyst at Evermount. "Warren," he said, voice hushed. "They're rewriting your reports." "What do you mean?" "I mean the finance team. Well, the Boston group they brought in? They're going back and altering the spreadsheets. The revenue logs. Even your audit trails. They're making it look like none of it ever happened." I felt my chest tighten. If they rewrote enough, the evidence might not survive a surface-level audit. It would look like I was wrong. Or worse, delusional. "Jason, I need your help. But only if you're willing." There was a pause. Then, "Tell me what to do." At that moment, I knew this wasn't going to be quiet anymore. We were stepping into a bigger storm. They hadn't just tried to bury the truth, they were rewriting history. But I still had the originals, and now I had allies. This was no longer about a job. This was about justice. The deeper we dug, the worse it got. Jason, brave as ever, had managed to retrieve several backup files from Evermount's internal archive, copies that hadn't yet been overwritten by the Boston cleanup crew. With those in hand, we compared every line item to the most recent reports filed with the SEC. Discrepancies jumped off the page like blinking red lights on a dashboard. And not the kind you could blame on human error. We were looking at what Thomas called layered manipulation, a term that chilled me to my core. They weren't just cooking the books, they were seasoning them to taste, dressing them up with just enough legitimacy to pass casual inspection. But the moment you drilled down into vendor trails and contract timestamps, it all unraveled. It wasn't just Brent Calloway. The corruption had roots deeper than I'd feared. By the end of that week, the SEC had formally launched a preliminary investigation, quiet, under the radar. I was officially classified as a cooperating witness. Sarah, my attorney, helped me file under the Dodd-Frank whistleblower program, which ensured I was legally protected and, if successful, eligible for a portion of any financial penalties recovered. That part didn't matter much to me. What I cared about was making sure they couldn't bury this. Thomas brought in forensic analysts. 2 of them, retired CPAs with backgrounds in corporate fraud and white-collar crime. They were methodical, patient, and utterly relentless. What they uncovered sent a chill through the entire team. Brent wasn't just massaging numbers to hit quarterly targets. He and 2 other senior executives, Douglas Hart, VP of Strategy, and Elena Price, General Counsel, had constructed a scheme that involved contract staging. Fake vendors were created using shell companies, often registered under distant relatives or offshore addresses. These vendors issued invoices for services never rendered, which were then recorded as operational expenses and capital improvements. That money? It didn't stay within Evermount. It circled back, laundered through dummy accounts, into performance-based incentive pools that Brent and his co-conspirators had access to. The higher the expenses, the tighter the margins appeared, and the more valuable Evermount looked when it miraculously beat expectations the following quarter. The goal was clear now: inflate performance, drive up stock value, and cash out before anyone noticed. The company had been preparing for a merger. That was the real endgame. They weren't trying to build a better business. They were trying to sell a mirage to the highest bidder. I stared at the charts, the wire flows, the LLC structures with shell addresses in Delaware, the Virgin Islands, even one tied to a P.O. box in Montana. And then it hit me: they had probably done this before. Thomas confirmed my suspicion. "We've seen these names pop up in 2 other investigations," he said grimly. "They're professionals. This isn't just greed, it's orchestration. We held off launching a full-scale subpoena just yet. If we moved too fast, they'd bury the rest of the evidence, or worse, spin it as a rogue employee scenario." The SC needed one last thing before striking confirmation that the board of directors either knew, or had willfully ignored, the warning signs. That's when Robert Wellen called. "I think I still have the original email chain," he said, voice hoarse. "The one where I refused to sign the Q1 audit unless Brent revised the entries. And the one where the board told me to trust Brent's guidance. I didn't delete it. I archived it. I didn't know if it would matter. It mattered." The email chain made one thing crystal clear: the board had been complicit, or at least grossly negligent. They'd allowed Brent to override internal audit concerns, permitted systemic changes in financial reporting without formal review, and ignored multiple red flags on record. We now had everything we needed. Sarah sat across from me in her office, flipping through the summary one last time. "Warren," she said quietly, "this is going to be big. When this breaks, it won't just be Brent who goes down. It'll be the board, the general counsel, maybe even outside partners if the merger was knowingly based on fraudulent figures." I nodded, but my chest felt heavy. This wasn't just a company making bad calls. This was deception, betrayal, on a massive scale. Good people had poured their careers into Evermount. I thought of Jason still stuck inside, of the staff who'd trusted the leadership to act with integrity, and of myself, nearly silenced with a smile and a severance package. But that silence was about to end. The raid came at 9:17 on a crisp Thursday morning. Evermount's sleek glass lobby had barely opened for the day when a team of federal agents and SEC investigators marched in, badges out, orders in hand. Witnesses later described it like a scene out of a movie: uniformed agents, black government SUVs, and stunned employees watching as doors were sealed and offices were cleared. Brent Calloway had been in the middle of a town hall video meeting with the New York office. He didn't even have time to mute the call before the agents walked in and asked him to step away from his computer. At the same time, agents entered Elena Price's office on the 14th floor. She demanded to see a warrant, which they provided, along with a printed list of aliases, shell companies, and internal documents that had been traced back to her desk. Douglas Hart, the VP of Strategy, tried to sneak out through the garage. He didn't make it past the second level before being met by federal marshals with a court order in hand. Within hours, the story hit the news cycle. Federal agents raid Evermount Systems headquarters amid financial fraud probe. CNN, CNBC, even local Denver news channels ran footage of agents loading file boxes into vans, of employees being escorted off floors and servers being disconnected mid-sync. My phone buzzed nonstop. Former coworkers, college friends, even old clients I hadn't heard from in years, all asking the same question: is this really happening? It was. Thomas called me around noon. "They're being thorough," he said. "Nobody's getting out of this with a PR statement." What the SEC found during the raid was staggering, worse than even we had predicted. In addition to the cookbooks, they found 2 entire internal systems built to mirror the real financials and subtly manipulate what outsiders saw. One system was designed for internal tracking and legitimate record-keeping. The other was for presentation purposes, with altered profit margins, scrubbed expenses, and modified vendor details. It was software-based fraud built into the daily workflow, so seamless most employees never even noticed. But the investigators did. They also found communications, emails, encrypted chats, between Brent Elena and a man named Gideon Marks, a shadowy figure tied to multiple financial engineering consultancies. Turns out, Gideon was a contractor who specialized in valuation enhancements for companies prepping for mergers. He had never been on payroll, but his fingerprints were all over the system design. Sarah called me in the evening. "It's a mess," she said, "and the SEC is furious. This isn't just securities fraud. This is intentional, organized deception. They're pushing for full cooperation from every senior official." That same night, I got a call from Jason. "They're offering immunity deals to anyone who'll testify," he said. "People are panicking. HR told everyone to stay home until further notice." I thanked him, hung up, and sat on the porch with a blanket over my shoulders and a hot cup of tea in my hands. The cold air bit at my face, but I didn't move. For the first time in months, I felt peace. They had tried to erase my work, smear my name, silence me with a severance check. And now they were scrambling to explain how they'd let it happen under their watch. By the following Monday, Brent Calloway had resigned, though the resignation was clearly forced. His public statement read like boilerplate: "Unfortunate misunderstanding. Committed to transparency. Transitioning to the next chapter." But the truth was clear to anyone paying attention. He'd been caught. Elena Price was placed on immediate administrative leave pending federal review. Douglas Hart was formally suspended, and the board released a vague message promising internal restructuring and full cooperation with authorities. But the real fallout was just beginning. Evermount's stock plummeted 47% in 3 days. Their pending merger was scrapped. Investors filed class action lawsuits. Shareholders demanded resignations. And behind the scenes, the SEC quietly began preparing for civil and criminal charges, not just against Brent and his team, but against several board members who had ignored repeated warnings. Thomas pulled me aside during a debrief and said, "You didn't just help expose a fraud, Warren. You stopped a $1 billion lie from being sold to the public." That hit me hard, because I'd spent so long thinking I was just one guy with a spreadsheet and a stubborn conscience. But it turns out, sometimes that's all it takes. I didn't expect the phone call from Evermount's board. It came 2 weeks after the raid, just as the headlines were beginning to quiet and the dust was settling over Denver's corporate skyline. I had been keeping a low profile, still technically unemployed, though I'd received a few discreet consulting inquiries. My days were quiet, filled with long walks, quiet dinners, and the occasional SEC debrief with Thomas and his team. So when Harold Sutton, Evermount's interim board chair, called me personally, I nearly let it go to voicemail. "Warren," he said, voice tired and formal, "the board would like to extend a formal apology and an offer." I said nothing. He continued, "We recognize that you were unjustly removed, and that your diligence prevented a catastrophic fraud from being sold to shareholders and the public. On behalf of what remains of Evermount's leadership, we'd like to ask if you would consider returning in a senior oversight role, reporting directly to the board." It was everything they thought I'd want. The money would have been generous, 7 figures, from what Sarah later confirmed. The role would come with sweeping authority, unrestricted access to internal systems, and a mandate to clean house. But I didn't even hesitate. "No," I said calmly. "You don't get to erase what you did by offering me a seat at the table you tried to throw me under." Harold sighed, but didn't argue. He thanked me again for my integrity and hung up. That was the moment I knew I was done chasing approval from people who only valued me when I was useful. I hadn't burned Evermount down. They had done that themselves. But I'd made sure the truth wasn't lost in the fire. Instead, I turned to something new. With Sarah's guidance and some of Thomas's contacts, I formed my own firm, Clarion Integrity Consulting. It started small, just me and an assistant named Valerie, who had retired from internal audit work years ago, but still had a sharp eye and sharper tongue. We specialized in post-fraud remediation, internal audit rebuilds, and helping companies recover after a crisis. Not just financially, but ethically. Word spread faster than I imagined. Within 6 months, Clarion had 3 full-time consultants, 2 Fortune 500 clients, and a waiting list. But more than that, we had purpose. I'd sit across from CEOs who thought they were invincible and ask them one simple question. "When's the last time someone told you the truth, and you listened?" Some of them hated that question. Some of them thanked me later. One morning, while sipping coffee and reviewing a client's compliance gaps, I got a call from Robert Whelan. "I've been watching what you're building," he said. "It's good work. Needed work." "Thank you," I said, genuinely moved. "How have you been? Retired?" He chuckled. "Officially. But there's one thing I still want to do before I call it quits. I want to help push federal legislation for stronger whistleblower protections. What happened to you, to me? It shouldn't be so easy to bury." I agreed. Over the next year, Robert and I joined a working group of former auditors, investigators, and ethics officers. Together, we drafted a proposal that would become known as the Corporate Whistleblower Accountability Act. It aimed to make NDAs like the one I was handed illegal if they attempted to suppress reports of fraud, misconduct, or endangerment. By the time we presented it in front of a bipartisan subcommittee in Washington, I was no longer the guy from Evermount. I was something else, a quiet reminder that integrity still mattered, and that even in a world of stock prices and executive bonuses, someone had to ask the hard questions and refuse to look away. Afterward, I sat alone on the steps of the Capitol. Staring out at the skyline, I thought about Jason, who'd risked everything by helping me inside the company. I thought about Sarah, who'd warned me just how close I came to signing my voice away. I thought about Thomas, who never once treated me like I was overreacting. But most of all, I thought about that first moment, months ago, when Elaine stopped smiling at her desk. When I knew deep down that something was wrong, and I was proud that I'd listened to that feeling. As I stepped off that train back in Denver, I didn't carry bitterness, only clarity. The company I once poured my soul into was now a chapter I'd closed. Not with revenge, but with resolution. Evermount may never fully recover, but I did, and in doing so, I discovered something far more valuable than any paycheck or promotion: peace of mind. I hadn't just uncovered fraud, I'd reclaimed my voice. My worth was never in the title on my office door. It was in my willingness to do what was right when it mattered most. Whether you're 35 or 75, let this be your reminder: if your conscience is screaming, listen to it. Sometimes, doing the right thing won't win you applause, but it will let you sleep at night. And that, friends, is priceless. If this story moved you or reminded you of someone who stood their ground in a tough moment, share it in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Let's keep shining a light on quiet courage, one voice at a time.